Hey, what's going on there, guys? Nick here from Absolute MTG, and I'm back with another deck tech for you. Today we are going to be taking a look at Red-Green Aggro for the modern format. The entire deck list is down in the description below for you guys that just want to check that out and use it as a reference. There's also a deck list via TappedOut.net where you guys can check out this deck. If you're not familiar with any of the cards that we're talking about here or anything in the deck list in the description, all you have to do is scroll over the card names with your cursor and you will become a little bit more familiarized with what the cards do. So, Red-Green Aggro for Modern, it's pretty much like aggro in any other format. Where we are going to be capitalizing here is mainly on creatures. We're going to be using efficient creatures and we're going to be basing things by power by number, where we are going to try and overwhelm our opponent with small yet efficient creatures that can at times become a little bit bigger than what they originally appear to be, especially with things like Experiment 1, Kird Ape, and Flinthoof Boar. And we also have some burn spells in here as well that are going to kind of seal the deal for us. But ultimately, we're just trying to play as efficiently as possible with the cards that we have, and we're just going to outrace our opponent. So, to look over the cards that we're playing here, we have 4 Goblin Guide, 4 Experiment 1, 4 Kird Ape, 4 Burning-Tree Emissary, 4 Flinthoof Boar, 4 Tarmogoyf, which, if you guys don't have Tarmogoyfs, if you don't have the money to swing for them, don't worry, you can still play something else in place of Tarmogoyf, like you can play more Scavenging Ooze. But Tarmogoyf, if you do have them, the deck prefers to play them because Tarmogoyf is so powerful. We do have the 4 Tarmogoyf, 2 Scavenging Ooze, 4 Ghor-Clan Rampager. For spells, we have 4 Lightning Bolt, 4 Rancor, and 2 Searing Blaze. For lands, we are just playing a playset of Verdant Catacombs and Arid Mesa. That is to search our Stomping Ground for us, also our Mountain and Forest, which we're playing 4 Stomping Ground, 2 Mountain, and 2 Forest. It can search up those for us. It also thins down our deck a little bit, which kind of helps with the probability of drawing certain things. It removes lands from our deck, which makes a small little impact. And we are running a playset of Copperline Gorge, which is just our Scar's quick land for us that we can play on the early turns without having it, without having any drawback to it. So, to talk about the main board, Goblin Guide is essentially our 2/2 for 1 mana with haste on turn 1 that we can play. The only downside to it being that whenever it attacks, our opponent reveals the top card of their library. If it's a land, they get to draw it, essentially. They get to put it in their hand. Experiment 1, 1/1 for 1 green. It gets bigger with Evolve, so when we start playing things like Kird Ape, Burning-Tree Emissary, Flinthoof Boar, and we're chaining things, like especially with Burning-Tree Emissary, the Experiment 1 is going to be able to get a whole lot bigger very, very quick, and if we played it on turn 1, we can do some really nice plays, like turn 2, be able to play like Goblin Guide and Kird Ape and level him up twice with that Evolve, put 2 more counters on him. So we're swinging with a pretty decently sized Experiment 1 on turn 2. But ultimately, he's just going to scale based on how many creatures we're playing and in what order we do that. We do have the Kird Ape, which is a 1/1 for 1 red, but gets +1/+2 as long as we control a forest. We have Burning-Tree Emissary, which is essentially like our free card. It's the Billy Mays card where it doesn't just stop with Burning-Tree Emissary. You get to add 1 red and 1 green whenever it enters the battlefield to our mana pool, and then we get to chain more things into it. We have the Flinthoof Boar, which is a 2/2 for 2 mana, and it gets +1/+1 as long as we control a mountain. And for 1 red, it can gain haste until the end of the turn, making it a pretty decent turn 3 play if we have the 3 mana open to be able to play that and just kind of clutch out a victory from there. Tarmogoyf, which is going to get bigger based on what's in the graveyard. We are running the 2 Scavenging Ooze here as well, so Scavenging Ooze is kind of like an interesting card to play in this type of a deck. It's not necessarily big right from the start, but it does give us a little bit of variation whenever we're playing up against things like Living End, and when we're playing up against things like Deathrite Shaman, where our opponent goes to eat something with Deathrite Shaman, and in response, we are going to eat it with our own Scavenging Ooze. So there's some small things that you can do with Scavenging Ooze to stop things from happening, like things going on in the graveyard if our opponent's trying to abuse that for their win condition. Scavenging Ooze is just kind of like a graveyard hate card that we can have in the main board that's also a pretty decently sized creature for 2 mana that we can grind out games with. If we're playing up against control or our opponent's knocking out our creatures, we can start eating creatures from our own grave, making the Scavenging Ooze bigger and keeping it out of like Lightning Bolt range. We have a playset of Ghor-Clan Rampager, so 4/4 for 4 with trample. However, It has a Blood Rush ability of 1 red and 1 green. We can discard it and give target attacking creature +4/+4 and trample until the end of the turn. So making it pretty much that we're only playing cards that are going to cost either 1 or 2 mana for us, which is pretty efficient for a aggro-based deck. We have our Lightning Bolt, which deals 3 damage to target creature or player. Rancor, which is going to enchant a creature, and the enchanted creature gets +2/+0 and trample. And whenever Rancor is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, we get to return it to its owner's hand. So if our opponent ends up killing off one of our creatures that has Rancor on it, then we can kind of recycle it. And the last card is Searing Blaze. So Searing Blaze, double red, and it deals 3 damage off of landfall to a creature and 3 damage to its controller. So we are going to be able to burn out one of our opponent's creatures and deal 3 damage to them. So it's kind of like a double lightning bolt, where we do pay for the cost of it, but we also are going to be able to hit 2 things with it at the same time. But without landfall, it's only going to deal 1 damage to the creature and 1 damage to our opponent. But we want to have that landfall going off, and our fetch lands make that possible to be able to use that during our opponent's turn and use Searing Blaze on their turn. For the sideboard, that's the last thing that we have here. So this is down in the corner here. So our sideboard, we have 3 Ancient Grudge, 4 Molten Rain, 2 Farie Macabre, 2 Grafdigger's Cage, 2 Torpor Orb, and 2 Dismember. So to talk about some of the different matchups and some of the different things you want them in, some of the cards are really straightforward. Some of them are kind of like, well, they can be used in different scenarios and whatnot. But Ancient Grudge is pretty much strictly just affinity, because affinity has power in numbers as well, and they can have blockers for days. So Ancient Grudge is something we can side in, we can start blowing up their dudes, and we are going to have a pretty fun time doing it, because for every Ancient Grudge that we have 2 uses out of it, being the normal casting cost and the flashback cost as well. The Molten Rain is basically just for the Tron matchups where we blow up their non-basic land, and then we're going to be able to deal 2 damage to them as well. The Molten Rain also will side in up against things like blue, white, red, because sometimes like Searing Blaze isn't really that good against blue, white, red, so we might as well side that out for Molten Rain. We really don't have the variability of like siding a whole lot of stuff against control, so Molten Rain ends up being alright against that matchup when we have dead cards. But Molten Rain is pretty much just strictly for Tron. The 2 Farie Macabre are basically for any graveyard tricks, anything that our opponent's doing, like Living End, anything like that. Even though Living End has a pretty concrete way of being able to overwhelm us, usually it's not a problem because we are going to be outracing Living End as it is. So the Macabres are for anything that's graveyard-based, anything silly. We kind of keep that in check, on top of having the 2 Scavenging Ooze in the main board as well. So total we have 4 graveyard hate cards. We do have 2 Grafdigger's Cage, which is basically just for the Birthing Pod decks, Kiki Pod and Melira Pod. Grafdigger's Cage is pretty much going to shut down Birthing Pod, Court of Calling. It's basically the 2 things that you want it to shut down. It's also going to shut down any Persist or Undying creatures that our opponents have. So we get to kind of hinder a lot of different ends of those pod decks from being able to actually do anything. The 2 Torpor Orb are basically going to be for decks that are going to capitalize on Enter the Battlefield abilities, so the Twin decks, where they're going to be able to use Splinter Twin to make infinite dudes. Torpor Orb is going to shut them down, so it's definitely nice to have that in the sideboard, and it doesn't really make anything in our deck bad except for Burning-Tree Emissary, which we can easily just kind of compensate for that with siding. But the Torpor Orb is basically just to shut down decks that are going to use Enter the Battlefield abilities. And the 2 Dismember are for decks that have troublesome creatures that we can't really get around. Things like Phyrexian Obliterator, where Dismember is going to be able to deal with them for us. So any creature-based threats, we can side in more creature hate with the Dismember here. So that is our deck tech. The entire deck list is down in the description below where you guys can check it out. It's also on TappedOut.net, where I mentioned at the beginning of the video. It's the link down in the description. And be sure to check out some of the other links in the description below, like the Facebook page, the Twitter page, and whatnot. There's some stuff down there for you guys to check out. If you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. But until next time, guys, peace out.